All right, verse 4. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before. Of course not, because Jacob's ending up with all the animals. But the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength. Yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes and see, all the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred. So he's getting Rachel and Leah, telling them that basically it's time to go. He's been here for 20 years. You'll see that in the succeeding passages, working for her father, building up his herds, and now building up his own herds. And it's time for him to go home, back to the promised land, because that's where he belongs. God just sent him there to get his wife, to get his wealth, and then go back, and then to be populating the land, and to have the 12 sons that will be the fathers of Israel. And so now he's going through all the things that's happened, so his wives will understand why he's wanting to leave. And remember, for them, they're leaving everything they've ever known, and they're going to go a long ways away, probably never to come back. So they're going to leave friends, family, what's comfortable, what's known, all that kind of stuff, and go someplace new. And so he's letting them know what he's doing and why. We also see that Laban tried to cheat him constantly. Because it didn't, originally when you read it, it sounds like, he says that if they're speckled, spotted, or striped, I get those animals. That's the agreement he made. But it actually was that Laban would say, okay, you can have the speckled ones, but that's all. So then they'd all be speckled. Then he'd say, well, no, you can't have the speckled ones, you can have the striped ones. Well, then they'd all be striped. Well, no, then you can't have either of those, you can have the spotted ones, then they'd all be spotted. And he kept changing it constantly over and over again. And because of that, God took his herds away. Because remember what God said to Abraham and to all his descendants. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. Laban is cursing him. Laban is trying to cheat him. So God turns it around on him in an extremely obvious way and takes his animals and transfers them all back over to Jacob, which of course makes Laban and his sons very unhappy. So now he knows it's time to go, because if this keeps going, what's eventually going to happen with Laban and his sons?
War.
They're going to kill Jacob, or at least run him off with nothing. No wives, no kids, no nothing. Because there's way more of them than there is of him. And they're all his kinsmen on his side. So he knows he needs to get out of town, and he needs to get out of town quickly. And then God comes to him and says, I'm the one that made all this happen. I told you ahead of time. We now find out that he had had a vision that said, God's going to make all the animals these different spotted, speckled, and that's why he made the agreement with Laban in the first place. Now, of course, we saw that Jacob did his part too, and like taking those branches, stripping them, putting them in the water. It was all part of that same process. And now he comes to him in a vision and says, it's time for you to go back home. It's time for you to go back to the land. Arise, go from this land and return to the land of your kindred. And what that tells us is Jacob from that point really shouldn't be afraid of anything. If God said go back, what's going to happen? Yeah, go back, you'll be protected and nothing will stop you. But yet that's not exactly how Jacob reacts. He still has a hard time trusting God with those kinds of things. So he also talks about Bethel, and I think I kind of ended here last week, in that from this point forward, Bethel becomes a place of great spiritual importance and worship throughout the history of Israel. It becomes one of the major worship sites when we split into the two nations of northern country of Israel, southern country of Judah. And in a lot of cases, it's a thorn in the side of Israel because false gods get worshipped there. Or they mix false worship with God worship there during the time of the divided nations. So you'll hear it'll come up multiple times as you read through the Old Testament. Now we go to verse 14. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? I mean, they see what's happening. Dad doesn't have much left, so therefore they're not losing anything if they go for part of it. And then it's, are we not regarded to him by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. So, he goes to him, explains the situation, tells him God says it's time to go, and they're all for it. They're, let's go. Dad has squandered everything. He's not treating you right, and that's why he's losing his money, and he's not about to change. So, yes, it's time to go. I also like the fact that they see that their father, has this anger towards Jacob. He's cut them off. He's probably cut them off from any inheritance of any kind, because they belong to the guy that's taking his animals, kind of thing, that type of thing. So he's acting as though they're foreigners, not his own daughters. He's treating them like they're not his daughters because they're with him. Also, I like how they see that they were basically sold to Jacob, especially Leah. He was tricked and all that kind of stuff. And then Jacob had to work 7 years for her and 7 years for Rachel, and they weren't thrilled with that whole situation. So they're just kind of going through how their dad treats them, so it wasn't that big a deal for them to leave. It seems like to Laban, his daughters were just a commodity, to get what he wanted, not to make sure they had the life they wanted, which is what he's supposed to do. And they agree that Laban's been cheating them and all of that, and yet God's prospered them instead. And then they come down to the end of this narrative with something very important. Whatever God has said to you, do. So they're in agreement with not only Jacob, but with God. Whatever God has said to do, do. And that's how we should always be in our lives and in our families. When God tells us to do something, do it, whatever it is. And we should be together as husbands and wives, or even as whole families if we have kids at home, that this is what God wants us to do, let's do it. Because God said so, do it. That's the only reason we need. And we don't need anything else. A lot of people want to break it down and study it and figure out how it's going to be accomplished and all this kind of junk. And that has nothing to do with the kingdom of God. If God says do it, what do? Do it. That's it. He'll take care of the rest. He'll provide whatever's needed in order to accomplish whatever it is he wants done. And I'm going to, at the same time, though, I don't think this is that easy of a decision for them to make. Like I said, they're not just leaving their father and stuff. They're leaving all their family, all their kinsmen, all their relatives. And that was a huge part of life back then. Families always stayed together out to multiple generations. And so it's not that easy a thing to do. And go to some place where they know nobody, to a new land that can even be hostile at times. And it's not a safe journey to get there. So let's see. And this may be part of the reason why God allowed Laban to do what he did to Jacob, because that motivates the two daughters to be willing to leave it go. So here I think you can see how God works, that he's working in multiple places and directions to bring about them leaving. The daughters are ready to go. Jacob's ready to go. They have their wealth. Laban's treating them terrible and things are only going to get worse, so there's motivation to go, that type of thing. And so God's working in multiple ways to get them to pack up and go back to the land. It's interesting, though, but in Jacob's life, we know that he goes back to the land. He's only there for probably 20 or 30 years, and then they have to leave again and go to Egypt, don't they? So he's out of the land again. So he goes, it's funny, God sends him far north to his kinsmen to get the women that are going to be the mothers of Israel. Not just Rachel and Leah, but Bilhah and Zilpah as well. Then he brings them back to the land for a while, and then he sends them off to Egypt to protect them during a time of famine and to give them a place where they can grow into a large nation. And a lot of people don't understand that. When God sends them into Egypt and they're there for 400 years, they go in as 70 people, I think it's 70 people, but they leave as millions. And that only happens because they're in a nation that's an empire that nobody can attack and destroy. They're safe. They're in a part of the land that the Egyptians don't want because they're not really into hurting animals. They like growing crops. And God orchestrates all this on purpose to help them grow into this big nation. But if he didn't make them slaves, what would have happened if God had come to them and said, okay, now it's time to leave and go to the land of Canaan, if they were still prospering and doing great in Egypt? They wouldn't have gone. So again, we can see God bringing this idea of slavery into their lives and making them miserable. That's not an accident. That's not a coincidence. That's all part of the plan so that they're ready to go when it's time to go and take off. And they're motivated to do it. And God works in our lives the same exact way. Calvin?
So what you're saying is, if he had just said leave and they weren't enslaved, they're like, we love it here.
Yes.
It's great. Why would we leave?
Well, that exact thing happens much later on when Israel gets defeated by Babylon, and most of the nation gets taken to the country of Babylon, and they have Daniel. What in the world? I just looked at my hands and they're black.
I was going to say that.
Really? What is that?
Am I dying?
I don't know.
It's that. Anyway, just kind of threw me off there for a minute. Whoa.
See you, folks.
Anyway, they went to Babylon, had Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel over them. And so they had like special protection status and they prospered tremendously. When it came time for them to go back to the land, only a very, very small portion of the people were willing to go. The rest stayed in Babylon because life was so good there. And then from there, they migrated all the way into Europe. And that's how they populated that particular area.
So just maybe start thinking like, it's like all things work out for good to those that love God. And then it's like, okay, so sometimes you go through situations where, the saints supposedly did, where actually it strengthened them.
Oh, yes. God,
uncomfortable situations.
Yes, God constantly takes us into very difficult situations to strengthen us, but also to motivate us and to get us to accomplish His will. As I've told you many times, God says the easy way and the hard way, and we can pick. We usually pick the hard way, but He wants us to pick the easy way.
What do you mean?
Well, like when I was working for Hughes Aircraft, there at the end of what I was doing there, I knew God wanted me to leave and be a pastor. Okay? And God was kind of kept pushing me to leave and be a pastor. Remember I kept saying I sent resumes everywhere but Tucson? I was even lying to myself. I felt like I was willing to go anywhere except Tucson.
Exactly right.
It wasn't until I finally said, okay, I'll pastor in Tucson, that I got to church within a couple of weeks. But what God did at the same time was Hughes Aircraft bought General Dynamics in California to get their programs and brought them back to our area in Tucson. And I got a new supervisor, why I don't know, that worked for General Dynamics. I didn't know this guy and he didn't know me. And I was working in the postal department, which we were split off as a separate group because we were working on civilian commercial stuff, not government stuff. Kind of government with the post office, but not defense things. So we were working in this separate group. I never saw the man. He never saw me, ever. And yet he signed my time cards because I was working directly for a vice president of the company in this new department. Well, it came time for our annual review right there at the end before I left. And Hughes was in the process of laying people off, and they said I was on the layoff list. But then the vice president and the woman that worked for him told me, no, we'll take you off that list. You're not going anywhere. Don't worry about it. You're integral, because there's only 5 of us doing a $3 billion program, engineering it. And so I said, okay, but my name never left the list. I'd look and I'm still there, And I'm like, what's going on with this? Oh, no, we'll get it taken care of. Don't worry about it. And then I'm not trying to brag or be arrogant here, but I just always tried to do my job well. I've never gotten a bad review, ever, from the first day I started working when I was young. So I go into this room, and at that point in time, I was working 12 hours a day, 6 and 7 days a week, designing multi-million dollars of mechanical equipment, and I'm an electronics guy, not a mechanical guy. But I knew the most about mechanical in the group of engineers that were doing it. And so I was getting my project done. I brought it in on time, ahead of schedule, and within budget. And we got the guys developing it to pay for their own parts of it and stuff. So I go into this meeting, and I'm a non-degreed engineer. And he looks at me and says, I think you're the worst employee I've ever had. You don't have any idea what you're doing. You're terrible at your job, and I'm giving you this horrible rating. Right. And I can't say that I've ever been that angry in my life. I don't get angry very easily. But I just looked at him and said, am I still on the layoff list? Yeah. I said, I volunteered. So then I went on the list. Well, then the people I worked for, oh, no, you can't do that. You're in the group with the program. I said, nope, you've been telling me. I'm done. And I'm not putting up with that. They even said they'd have him retract the rating and stuff. I said, nope. But see, it's because God was trying to get me to leave, and I wouldn't go. So finally God just said, okay, I'll make you leave. And he finally did. But look at how God works things out.
That's interesting. Yeah.
This is the only time in Hughes Aircraft's history that I know of that they paid severance pay. They laid off people and hired people constantly because it depends on the contracts they get. In that business, you can get a huge contract. And the next year, they can take the whole contract away from you. You've bought all the equipment, spent all the money, and that happened. You have to bid every year, every couple of years. So they were used to that. They didn't ever pay severance. Well, this time, I got severance pay. I got all my vacation because I'd saved up 6 weeks, and I got extra pay for 1 week's pay for every year I worked there. And they carried my medical insurance for 6 months. And I went to a church that paid $18,000 a year, no benefits. And so the money from Hughes kept us going. Well, I got the church back on its feet. And by the time my 6 months was up, they could afford to pay for my insurance. But see, God's working all those pieces at once. That's why when we go to God and say, why are you letting this happen? God usually says one thing. Well, sometimes he says 3 things. Shut up.
Shut up. Yeah.
And trust me.
Yeah, right.
Or just trust me. Because if I try to tell you all that I'm doing, you can't handle it.
Right.
Your brain will explode. He's moving lots and lots and lots of pieces all at one time to bring about his will for our lives and to get us to go along with what he wants.
It seems like he even let you think it was your idea.
Oh, afterwards is when you figure it out. Oh, that's what was going on. That's when you get it figured out. That type of thing. So, and that's how God works. That's why I said there's the easy way and there's the hard way. And it's up to us which way we want to go. That type of thing. So, now I forgot where I am. Okay. Verse 17. So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels. He's a really nice guy. They get to ride. Usually the camels haul all the stuff and you walk. But the thing is, he has lots and lots of camels and donkeys and all that. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father, Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with all that he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. So being who he is, he figures out I've got to sneak out or he'll try to stop me. Because Laban's trying to figure out how to get Jacob's animals transferred back to him, type of thing. And this is also where the idea that, remember when God let Laban move all the speckled, spotted, and striped animals 3 days away? Well, guess how far away he is shearing those animals? 3 days away. So now Jacob knows he's got 3 days to get out of town and get on the trail, and hopefully they won't be able to catch him. And so he takes off, knowing where he is. And you'd think that, losing all his animals to Jacob, you might think that Laban would want him gone. But I don't think so. I think he had a scheme in mind to try to then get him back. Or just by force. Grab Jacob, throw him out and say, go home. The wives, the grandkids, and the animals, they're staying here. It's not a thing Jacob could have done. So he loads them up on camels and they take off, headed back the way he came. So there's kind of some pictures of what that probably looked like. These are camels, modern camels, modern times, loaded with tents, Bedouin tents. Because there are still Bedouins that travel all over Saudi Arabia and live in the deserts and use camels and tents and pack them up. And also being that they're nomads, it didn't take them long to pack up and hit the road. Because when you're a herdsman, you can't stay in one place. Especially not with herds that big. You have to constantly be on the move.
And actually those tents, from what I see, if it's similar to what it was then, they're really nice. I mean,
Yes.
Really beautiful.
Inside, they're like very expensive
Very
homes.
simple living.
Yes.
Yeah.
What's funny today is you'll see a microwave dish and all that kind of stuff on the back of a camel and a generator because they watch TV out in the middle of the desert.
Right.
That type of thing. By the way, that reminds me, do you know who invented the RV? The motorhome? The Mongolians. I don't know if you've ever seen, but Mongolians got the idea of building a big platform with wheels and putting their yurt on it and then pulling it with their animals, and that way they basically had the first RVs they could take wherever they went. They didn't have to tear down and set back up again.
It's very simple living.
Also, scientists are starting to be convinced that they're the ones who actually invented the wheel, the Mongolians, because they needed it because they traveled so much. And that it then worked its way back down into Asia and Northern Europe, but they were the ones who actually invented the wheel. And so there's camels with tents, and here's what it's kind of like traveling by camel with a saddle. up there all day. I tried to find families on camels, but I couldn't find any. This was as close as I could get. And so they all got on saddles like that and took off. But they can't go very fast because they also have the donkeys, the cattle, the sheep, the goats, small children, who don't really want to travel from sunup to sundown and all that. Now, some of the small kids, what they would do is they put pannier packs on like the back of a donkey, and one kid went in each one. So, you could see a little head sticking out while they rode along, that type of thing. So they get on their camels and they take off. And here's the route they're going. This is the route. The blue line is the route that they're traveling. They're leaving Haran, and they're going to head down to a place called Gilead. And the blue line, it's got arrows on both ends because Jacob basically went the same way, going and coming home, which in that day, there weren't really many ways, not a lot of alternate routes. What paths and roads there were used by everybody, and there really weren't a lot of different ones. And you basically had to follow where there's water. That's what dictated how you traveled, is where you could find water. Just like in the West, you traveled by where you could find water. That's it. There's no other way to get through it. So now, this is where Rachel steals her father's household gods and takes them with her. Now, what this tells us is that they worshipped more than just the God of the Bible, because they had household gods, which were extremely common, still are to this day, in other countries. But the Romans, the Greeks, they all had household gods. And they had different household gods depending on who you were, your family line, and all that kind of stuff. Remember I told you before, they had personal gods, household gods, family gods, town gods, village gods, city gods, country gods, overwhelming, overarching gods. They just had hundreds and sometimes thousands. And their lives were far more constrained by religion than ours. They were 100 times more religious than we are today. Everything in the life of ancient people was controlled by the gods and dealing with them, offerings and, all the different things, all the different kinds of things that they did, where everything was controlled and restricted by the gods. They were not really free at all because their lives far more restricted than ours are today. Now, we're restricted morally. The Bible gives us moral things to live by. They didn't have that, but all the rest of their life was controlled by the gods in a lot of different ways. Who they could marry, what they could do, where they could go, all that kind of thing. And so they have household gods, which means they're probably still worshiping the gods of the Chaldeans. And so they've done what a lot of people did. They just add God to what we call their pantheon. A pantheon of gods is a whole group of gods. And so they would add them to their pantheon of gods. That's what Darius does in the Old Testament with Daniel, and that's what Nebuchadnezzar does. They never abandon their gods. They just add God to theirs and say he's the supreme God. But they still keep their other gods as well. Unfortunately, Israel did it in reverse. They had their God and then added everybody else's gods. And as you read the Old Testament, you'll see that there were a lot of people, foreigners and heathens, that would look at the Jews and say, those people are nuts, because they have every god. They accept every god of every people, whereas each people group had their own gods, and their gods were the only gods, and that's it. And they were true to them. The Jews had everybody's gods. And yet they had the only God that actually existed. But yet that's what they did. And God even prophesies that in a lot of the different prophets. You'll see he talks about that. So let's see. So they're headed here to Gilead, which is this area kind of in between the Dead Sea and the Lake of Galilee, or Sea of Galilee. And that's where they're headed, back to where his family was the last time we saw him, 20 years ago.
Excuse me. Whatever. Okay, so Job, when was he? Way before this? Or?
Job?
Yes.
Job is considered probably the oldest book in the Bible. So he would have been way before this.
But he only had
Now, let me say this so for the camera, that the question was Job before this time period? And yes, he was long before this time period.
And he only had one God. He only had one God.
Yeah, he knew God, yes.
So what happened?
Well, as man split up and, from the Tower of Babel went across the earth and on it went, what was it they got sent across the earth? They were disobedient. That didn't change when they got sent to other places. And so they just then started making up their gods and so on and so forth. There's a funny thing about human beings that I don't care how much someone says they're an atheist. Everybody has a God. God built it into our nature. We cannot live without a power outside of us that's greater than us. To many atheists, it's science. To many atheists, they're God of their own lives, and they think they have the power to do whatever they want. And that's why they're the most frustrated people in the world, because they find out they don't. That life throws all kinds of things you can't handle at you. But everybody, it could be money, it could be sex, it could be relationships, it could be power, but everybody has a God. Because I find it funny when people try to say, well, we evolved, and we came from monkeys, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, then why did every single human being in ancient times create a God? That's not something that evolves. Why would they create a God, the supernatural being, more than them if all they've ever known is the natural?
That's interesting.
But see, what we know is the people on Noah's Ark all knew God. They taught their children about God, the only God. There were no other gods. And on it went as they, until they became disobedient and got scattered across the world. So there was knowledge of God with all the people pretty much around the world in the beginning. Now, over time, as they got farther and farther away physically, but also spiritually, that was disappeared and it just became their local gods and their false gods. But man really likes to make his own gods because then we get to dictate who the gods are and what they do. And isn't it funny that all the false gods are just like human beings? They're liars, cheaters, adulterous, they're just like us, which should tell us we made them, because they're just like us. God of the Bible is the only one that's totally different than us and requires of us things totally different than we come by naturally, type of thing. So they headed down to Gilead. Now, they traveled relatively quickly, and it told us there that they crossed the Euphrates in 3 days and headed for the hill country of Gilead. So, the Euphrates is way up here, so they didn't take them that long to cross it and then head down. And remember back then, crossing rivers was one of the most dangerous things you could do, one of the most difficult things you could do. In our world, it's no big deal. We have bridges everywhere. But imagine if every time you came to a river, you had to go through it with your camels, your animals, your children. And they're very dangerous things. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people have died in the United States crossing rivers. And that's why even in ancient times, when people like Darius, Nebuchadnezzar, and others built roads and bridges, is one of the greatest technological advances of that civilization. And it also enabled that civilization to move forward with prosperity. Because now people can travel easily from location to location and do trade. Just read some of the diaries and stuff of like when they did the great cattle drives, from Texas and stuff on up into Kansas and Nebraska and places like that. How many cowboys died crossing rivers? How many animals were lost crossing rivers? And also, if you come up to it, they had a lot more patience than us. If it just rained, what happens to the river? Yeah, you can't cross it. So you just sit on the other side for a day, a week, 3 weeks until the water goes down, and then you can get across. That type of thing. And not many people think of bridges as being a huge deal, but they were. They made an enormous difference with travel, type of thing. We don't think of bridges as high technology, but they were. To be able to cross a river safely at any time of the year was a huge move forward. Let's see, I got to remember where I am. Okay, verse 22. When it was told to Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him for 7 days and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." So, of course, there were servants and probably even other relatives of Laban still in the area when Jacob took off. Well, they immediately jumped on their camel, their donkey, or whatever, and took off to tell Laban, Jacob's taken off with all of his animals and your daughters and your grandkids. So he drops what he's doing and he takes off after him. But that means Jacob has a minimum of a 3-day head start. But there's no question that he's going to catch him because you can't move that fast with herds and kids. And yet all it is men, a fighting age that are with Laban, and they can move very quickly. And so it takes them 7 days, though, to finally catch him. And they catch him in the hill country of Gilead. They catch him in this area. And my guess is, what do you think Laban wants to do? Yep, he wants to get rid of Jacob and take everything back with him. Absolutely. Okay, and that's why God appears to him and says, not only do you not touch him, you don't even say anything to him, good or bad. You know, you leave him totally alone. And you know, God, to our knowledge, God has never spoken to Laban before, not directly. He's heard about God, he's had other people tell him that God speaks to him, but this time he gets it directly. So he gets his kinsmen, uncles, nephews, all the males that can travel and fight, and takes off after Jacob. That's what makes you think he intends on doing harm, because why would he need to take all these guys? Right. If he just wants to say goodbye to his kids and grandkids, you know, type of thing. And so they catch up to him. So then God appears to him and says, yeah, you need to be very careful here. Because God's basically saying, you do anything other than what I tell you and you're done. You're toast. You know, I'll take your life and everybody with you, type of thing. So I'm sure that Laban is extremely angry, you know, and really wants to do some harm to him, but now he knows, nope, don't do it. So verse 25. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what have you done that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Sure he did. Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs with tambourine and lyre? Yeah, that's exactly what he would have done. This guy is something else. And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? When he says sons, he means grandsons. But in their day, that term could mean any male relative at that point in time. You know, then he says, and why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. Notice how he throws that in there. I could harm you. But the God of your father spoke to me last night saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And now you have gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? He's a bit of a nutcase, old Laban is. But notice what he's doing, because we humans do this. Well, let me back up a little bit. Okay, it takes 7 days of hard travel, and they finally catch up to him. He's really upset, accuses Jacob of tricking him by not saying anything, but, you know, even Laban knows why he did it. You know. And notice, though, how Laban tells the story. He tells the story so that Jacob's the bad guy. See, that's how we always do it. That's why there's two sides to every story. Because the other person is always the bad guy. You know, whatever's going on. And he says, you've driven away my daughters like captives of the sword. You stole them against their will. He has no knowledge whatsoever of what transpired other than that they left. But he's saying this to make himself feel better, because that makes Jacob the bad guy who's wronged Laban. Okay? And we'll do the same exact thing often in our own lives. And, you know, then he goes on to say, he tells him that, you know, if you would have told me, oh, we'd have had a great party and laughing and mirth and song and dancing and fear. Sure you would have. Has Laban done anything like that for Jacob in the entire time he's been there? No, not ever. You know? And again, he's trying to make himself look good. Remember, all of his kinsmen are there. They probably don't know all that's gone on, the cheating, the lying, all that sort of thing. But they're about to learn, you know. We'd have had tambourines and lyres and, you know, not people who lie, but the lyre that you play that's like a harp.
The lyre.
You know. What's it? The lyre?
Lyre.
The lyre. Yeah. So, you know, and you're like, huh. Then he complains he wasn't allowed to kiss his grandsons and daughters farewell. The daughters who he treats like foreigners and sold to Jacob for 14 years, those daughters. You know, he's so upset he didn't get to kiss them goodbye. Type of thing. You know, that, you know. So, and the truth is, Jacob had to sneak away, or he knows he wouldn't have been able to go, and Laban knows that too. You know, but now see, they're far enough away from home that even if Laban wanted to try to make him go back, it would be very difficult to take that whole group and make them go back again. They could have, but it would not have been easy. And so it's even more, it makes it even more likely that Laban will take what God said to heart. You know, it's going to be very difficult. And God said he'll kill me, basically, if I don't leave them alone. So, and finally he admits, which I kind of find interesting, to Jacob that God has warned him not to do any harm to Jacob. He doesn't have to tell him that, but he does. And maybe he's just explaining why he's not killing him and taking everything back. But he knows enough about God to know that God's an active God. And when God speaks, you really don't want to cross what he said. He's not like the other gods they have that don't do anything, unless a coincidence occurs that you want him to do something, then that happens. But that's just coincidence. That's not the God. So, and then what I think is funny, though, is the weird way he changes the subject. He's going all down to, you took my kids, you left, I don't get to kiss them, we're going to have a party. Why'd you steal my gods? It kind of comes out at the end is, what? He's trying to find something to put Jacob in the bad. That, you stole my gods. So verse 31. Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. He doesn't know Rachel took them. He's just made a statement that if they find Rachel with them, they have to kill her. Because he said they will not live. You really shouldn't. That, to me, what that is, you got to be careful what you say. All the time in the Bible, people stick their foot in their mouth that has serious, serious consequences. And what I see in modern time is people have totally lost that ability. They say whatever's in their head. And that's why they get shot on the roads and all kinds of things that happen. If you've ever watched any of the videos of Karens, you know what a Karen is?
Yes.
A woman that is out of her dang mind in most cases, and they'll go up to somebody's house and just say the craziest stuff. I saw one where this woman in England knocks on this guy's door. He opens it, and she's raking him over the coals because he lets his 2-year-old daughter dress in pink. She's just bad-mouthing him and, going on and on because he's not letting her express her gender. He's forcing her to be a girl. He's like, she's 2! And her favorite color is pink. That's why she wears it. But this lady feels like it's her right to intervene in this family and tell them what to do. And you see it all the time. And I mean, they just say all kinds of stuff.
Do you think it's in the food? People
No, it's got everything to do with social media and the anonymity that you can say whatever you want, and then that carries over into doing it in person.
Whatever's in your mind.
Where there are consequences.
Well, you said that, like, Laban's kinsman didn't know what was really going on. I'm like, well, didn't Jacob complain, or wasn't there gossip back then?
Well, he probably complained in the family, and it probably was gossip. But with gossip, you don't know what's exactly true or not. And they probably knew some of it, but they probably didn't know that he changed his wages 10 times, that all the different agreements and all that kind of stuff. It depends on the relative. Some of them may live far away. It just came together for sharing, and they don't see each other very often, type of thing. So, let's see. Where am I? Okay. So Laban, where am I? Verse 32, anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours and take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. Now remember, this goes all the way back to him wanting the speckled, the striped, the spotted. So it's obvious he didn't steal anything. So he knew that Laban was going to try to accuse him of that at some point. And now here it's happening. Well, Jacob knows he didn't take anything. So he's being very tough about it in this situation. Throws it back into his lap and says, okay, you go find it and bring it out here and show it to all of us. So that's what happens next in verse 33. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the 2 female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but he did not find them. And she said to her father, let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me. So he searched, but did not find the household gods. So he goes in tearing everybody's house up, like, when they show on TV when the cops come into your house looking for something. They don't usually leave it in good shape. Right. They throw off stuff on the floor and move everything, and that's what Laban's doing. He goes into Jacob's tent because he's sure it's Jacob that did it. Nothing. Well, then he goes into Leah's tent. Nothing. Then Bilhah. Then Zilpah. Then finally Rachel goes into her tent. And that's where they are. And things get really ugly from this point. And really bad stuff could happen. But she's pretty smart. She puts him in the saddle that was on her camel that's been taken off for the night. Then she sits on it. And then he tells her what? She's on her period. And you know how men are when it comes to things that have to do with a period. He doesn't want any part of that. You know, it's like when your wife tells you to go get me some feminine stuff from the store and freaks you out when you're a young husband. You want me to what? And you know, and you're bewildered by all the stuff that's there. But you know, so she knows that'll work. He won't tell her to get up, and he won't be touching anything she sat on. You know, and that's why he doesn't find him. So, and he didn't even notice. You know, he doesn't find a thing. Doesn't notice that she's sitting on her saddle. You know, and that he hasn't searched that. So, she's got lady issues. That's what she said. Now, I find it very interesting at this point that Jacob allowed false gods to be a part of his family. You know, the only God he's ever known is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They didn't worship false gods. Abraham converted to worshiping God way back when he was at Ur of the Chaldees and followed God to the land of Canaan, and that's all they've worshipped. Now he's with these other people who believe in God but also have these other gods, and yet Jacob allows it. Remember what I said about being a passive man? You know, he lets his wives get into all these problems because he's passive. He lets one wife hire him out to the other one as a stud, you know, and doesn't do anything about it or say anything about it, that type of thing, and it just goes on and on.
So, okay, so I want to follow through on this. So you're saying passive is not a good thing, right?
Passive, the question is it's not good for men to be passive. What I mean is I'm not talking about people that are aggressive and all that. I'm talking about in a family. The man, God says the man is the leader, right, the spiritual leader, and he's to guide and lead that family, not be passive and let everybody else do it, or right, just let life go where it floats.
Right. It seems like whether either society or the devil or whatever, but in what's happening,
those are the same thing.
They want men to be passive.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
It's really grossly
because Satan knows that when men act like men, particularly in the spiritual realm, he loses. And so if you'll notice in America, a guy named Dr. Dobson figured this out about 25 or 30 years ago. He's dead now. But he realized what's happened is the school system and society has been working like mad to turn men into women.
Right.
That's why they give boys Ritalin. Because little girls sit into class, they're still, they're quiet, and they're studious by and large. Boys bounce off the walls because they're full of testosterone. So what do? We can't have them acting like boys. We've got to make them act like girls. And now if you notice, you look at so many young men, they dress and act like girls. They wear makeup. They wear earrings and jewelry, and they're scared of everything, and so on and so forth. You know, because, and if you act like a man in today's world, what will happen to you? In most cases, you get thrown in jail if you act like a man. You know,
weird,
like a man does.
That's weird.
And this whole system, I mean, when I was a kid, two grown men could have a disagreement, punch each other's lights out. Yes. Nobody would call the cops. Nobody thought anything of it. They settled it.
Exactly.
Two kids could get in a fight. They had a fight, and it was over, and they went about their business. Now, if two kids get in a fight, everybody goes to jail. Parents, kids, everybody.
And the guys used to get, because I used to do that from New York, right? And after that, most of the time, you're friends after that.
Mm-hmm.
You just get it
out. It's very
common,
yes. Yeah. And that's part of why kids get shot at school, because none of that's allowed anymore. And a kid that's being picked on all the time and he can't fight back, he finally loses it and he goes and gets a gun and he shoots a bunch of people. You know, because the schools also don't punish the bullies. They punish everybody equally, which is ridiculous.
Yes.
That's like doing it in our court system and saying, well, you know, this guy robbed you, you're both going to have to go to jail. Because if you didn't have that stuff, he wouldn't have robbed you. That's exactly what they do in school. Imagine how frustrated you would get if that's how it was.
That's so interesting, though. What you just connected there is like, because we used to be able to express ourselves, fight on the playground, beat each other up, and then we're friends after that, right?
Yeah.
But now you can't do that. But that natural energy is still there, and if you can't get it out that way, it comes out in a very weird way.
Yes.
And destructive.
You can't totally stifle. I'm not saying that people should be fighting all the time. I'm just saying that's
have,
part of being a little boy. The reason Dr. Dodson got involved was he got all these letters and emails from young mothers, and this was 30 years ago, about how there's something wrong with their boys. They're crazy. You know, they'll get on the roof and jump off, and they play with this, and they do that. They, you know, and what do we do? What kind of medication? And Dobson kept writing back and saying, they're boys being boys. It's been so stripped from our society. These young mothers didn't know that's how boys are supposed to act. You know, and so he finally wrote a book, Bringing Up Boys, because he got so tired of writing the same thing over and over and over, and sent it out, and then that helped a lot. But I mean, like when we were little boys, we snuck my dad's gunpowder, put it in jars, and lit it with matches, and went flying across the property. And we had BB gun wars, and dirt clod wars, and rock wars, and any game we played. I don't care what it started out. It could start out as checkers, and it would end up as a free-for-all.
Didn't you guys put the hairspray cans in the
Yeah, my
fire?
mom would use hairspray, and we burned our trash. And you know, back then, Combat was one of the real popular TV shows. And it seems like in every show of Combat, they would open the top of the tank and throw a grenade in and shut it. Boom. Well, that's what we did. That was the tank. My mom would separate all the hairspray cans out in a separate bag so they didn't get burned, but we knew where she put it. So we'd go get it, and we'd throw them in there. Boom! The trash would go everywhere, and she'd come out and go, I thought I got all those cans out of there. Well, Mom, you must have missed one. we didn't tell her till we were like in our 30s. You know? All this, she kind of didn't like us to come visit because we tell her all the stuff we did she didn't know about. You know, that kind of thing. And you know, that was just a normal day for us. You know, we'd go over to the ditch and dig huge holes in the side of this huge ditch bank, then run and jump on the top of it so it collapse in around us and bury us to our necks. You know, and junk like that. And we beat each other up all the time, just playing, not being mean, you know, that kind of stuff. And we thought having a dirt clod fight was the most fun in the world. You know, you get a trash can lid and a bunch of dirt clods and go at it. And you might be bleeding and, you know, that kind of stuff, but we didn't even think about going inside, you know. But worse than that, we drank from the hose.
Oh, yeah.
No fear whatsoever, you know.
Yeah, there's something wrong with that.
But no, you're absolutely right. Society's been working like crazy because what stands between anarchy and civilization? Men. That's it. Modern women who try to say, oh, we don't need men, blah, blah. That's only because they live in a controlled society where they are kept safe by predominantly men. You strip that away, there isn't. You're done. You're done. And women, I mean, there are women that are fairly strong, but see, women by nature are not aggressive and strong and like to fight and all of that kind. A few, but not by and large. It's just like I get so tired of hearing we got to get more girls into STEM classes. Science, technology, engineering. Do you know why women aren't in those classes? There is no barrier. There's nobody that said, well, you can't take a programming class. You're a girl. They're not interested. That's that simple. They're not interested. Women go into communications and social work. That's what they're interested in. Men are interested in engineering, mechanics, those kinds of. There's a few women, but not many. I worked in that field for a long time, and I only had 2 or 3 women in the entire 10 or 15 years that came into that and worked in it because that's what they wanted to do. It has nothing to do. They always act like there's all these barriers and girls can't go into science classes. It's like, not any place I've ever been. They don't want to. They're not interested. You know, that kind of thing. So, I don't know how we got there, but anyway, we're back to him being, he's supposed to be the leader of his family, Jacob is. He's supposed to be the spiritual leader of his family, which means he should have gotten rid of those false gods and said, you can't have anything to do with not We're getting them all out of here. We're not going to worship them. We worship the one true God, and that's it. End of story. And I brought it up before. In the New Testament, when a man gets saved, what generally happens to his entire family? The whole family gets saved. It shows the influence of a man. If the woman gets saved, what happens? In most cases, just the woman. You know? But when the man gets saved, then the whole family.
What is that?
It's the way God made the whole structure of life. Is that a man has that kind of influence. But we've been told for multiple generations now that we have no point, no purpose, and no influence. Yet they've done studies and shown that if there's a father in the home who pays no attention to the children, none. He goes to work, he comes home, he sits down, he watches sports, and he drinks beer, and that's it. The boys in that family are 75% less likely to get in trouble with the law just because he's in the house.
Oh, right.
That's it.
Right.
Just because he's in the house. That's it. When my school church in Tucson, we had a preschool. And Debbie was a 3 and 4 year old teacher. And she's very tough and very strict. All I had to do, though, was walk in the room and stand there, not say a word. And she would say the whole temper of the room changed.
Wow.
Those kids would suddenly become far more obedient, far more willing to listen, far less disruptive, just because I stood there. They don't know me from anybody, because I'm a man and I'm there. And after having been involved, and I cannot tell you how many little kids' lives, because of Leah, babies and toddlers and stuff, I've seen what the influence of a man does to small children. It's absolutely amazing that what happens when they interact with me. Not that I'm anything special, I'm just a man who's interested in them. And that's it.